On the award itself, it says, Mr. Borys Wrzesnewskyj MP, the Estonian-Canadian Medal of Merit for his outstanding contribution to Canadians of Estonian heritage.
Honorary Consul Generals Lebat and Heso, Charte d'Affaires, Mr. Krug, ladies and gentlemen, this is a particular honor. You see, the community that I was raised in and your community have lived a similar experience in this wonderful Canada of ours. Both of our communities were communities of DPs, displaced persons. And it's especially a significant honor for me because besides that common experience that our communities have lived here in Canada, we have a tragically common history in our ancestral homelands. And I thought I'd also share with you how I first became aware of the Estonian-Canadian community. You see, as a small boy, I spent part of my childhood in the Queen Bathurst neighbourhood of Toronto. And it was a neighbourhood of DPs, of various backgrounds, those displaced persons that I'd mentioned. There were several Ukrainian churches, a Polish church at Denison and Queen, a Slovak church just west of Queen and Bathurst. There were delis, Polish delis, Ukrainian delis, there was a Prague deli, a Czech deli, and then there were bakeries. Now, what was fascinating was I grew up in a household where I learned two languages, Ukrainian and Polish. So in that neighborhood, I pretty much understood everyone. I could go to Prague deli, where all the Czech men would be ordering their schnitzels, and even though the language was different, I could pretty much understand what they were saying. I remember once I actually went to the Slovak church service, and once again it sounded different, but it was fascinating for a small boy because I could understand them. But there were three bakeries in our neighborhood. There was a Polish bakery a little further west at Ossington and Queen. There was our family bakery. And there was a bakery at Denison and Queen called Runim's. And you know, as a little boy, I'd go into Runim's bakery. And I'd stand there listening to these Estonians, and I'd try so hard to pick up words, and I couldn't understand a word. Yet they were part of our community. I just couldn't understand a word. And one day I actually got the courage to ask for the baker to come out. And I'm not sure, I assume today that it was probably old man Runim. But this man, older man, came out, and I introduced myself. I was a pretty small boy, but I introduced myself as the grandson of the owners of Future Bakery down the street, and I'd like to see his bakery. And he actually smiled and took me up to the second floor, and I remember there were these three Estonian ladies there. He introduced me to them. He showed me around. And I remember saying, I don't understand when you speak. And he said, you know, our people have a lot in common. Well, I politely thanked him for the tour, but I thought, you know, what do we have in common? I can't understand a word. And I gotta tell you, the sweet and sour rye didn't taste at all like our rye bread. And it was as I got older that I began to understand why we have so many things in common. And I realized how similar our historical experiences have been centuries of occupation under Kremlin imperialism, and at what horrific a cost that historical experience had come. And friends, that's why soon after, when I was elected in Parliament in 2005, I introduced a piece of legislation to have visitor visas removed for Estonia and the other Baltic states. It was under a Liberal government, and then I did it again in 2006 under a Conservative government. And I remember speaking to Peter several times about this one and raised it over and over in the House of Commons. And I wanted visitor visas removed for Estonia and the other formerly occupied countries because I wanted to make sure that we bound Estonia closer to Canada and the West. And it's because I know the history that several years ago, when I was invited for a diplomatic luncheon by the Speaker of the House of Commons, Peter Milliken, in honor of a special guest, the Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia, Mr. Kislyak. And unfortunately for the Speaker, he actually asked me to say a toast. And very undiplomatically, I raised the issue of the cyber attack that was occurring at that time against Estonia, the Estonian government, by the Kremlin. And it was fascinating for all my parliamentary colleagues who were around that table, because all of a sudden this very polished diplomat, that smooth facade came down, and we saw the barrier. And he lost his cool, and he began attacking Estonia. And in fact, the Estonians weren't properly thankful to the Soviets who had liberated Estonia. Actually, we have a wonderful picture from that particular moment where the former Deputy Foreign Minister's hand is shaking at my face. It's one of my favorite pictures. But that's why it was such an honor to sit in the lobby of the House of Commons and go through the draft of Black Ribbon Day, the draft of the motion that passed unanimously in the House. You see, it's not only a day to remember, but it provides a vehicle to help educate Canadians, Canadian politicians, about the reality of the history. You see, most people in the West understand World War II in a very different way. It's only a partial history. And yes, the Western Front in Europe was horrifically bloody. But the Eastern Front was exponentially worse. You had genocides. You had people killed in the hundreds of thousands by bullets to the back of their heads. You had massive ethnic cleansings on a scale and sequentially in ways that humanity had never seen. And when the West was celebrating the victory of World War II, in our communities, there was always a certain sadness. Because you see, that Yalta Accord with Uncle Joe, for us was actually the Yalta Appeasement of diabolical Stalin, and led to the enslavement of close to 20 nations behind the Iron Curtain. The West's freedom and consequent prosperity that all of us here have enjoyed came at a horrific human cost. And for decades, we've held that flame of belief that one day freedom would once again come to our ancestral homelands. Our communities have common bonds that bind us tightly together. We should not forget the past, our common histories, and we should always be vigilant as we look towards the future, especially in an era where we see a neo-authoritarianism and neo-imperialism in its embryonic stages in the Kremlin. Thank you once again for this tremendous honor. It was mentioned that I speak Estonian. No, I don't. But let me give this a try. Elago Eesti Vabariik.